There is a saying that goes, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, in reference to the 6 wives of King Henry VIII. Perhaps the one that has the biggest impact and leaves the longest legacy is the one who survived, Katherine Parr. Though she didn't live long, just 36 years, and she only outsurvived King Henry VIII by 20 months, yet she had a huge influence on the next 60 years and beyond of English history. Often sidelined and overlooked, she was a remarkable woman who swayed history, and she grew up here in Rye House, Hertfordshire. Katherine Parr was born in London in 1512 into a well-to-do family. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, was an official in the royal household, and her mother, Maud Green, was a lady-in-waiting to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, with some people suggesting she named her daughter after her. Prior to marrying Henry, Catherine was married and widowed twice. Firstly to Edward Burgh, where she would have lived in Gainsborough Old Hall, and secondly to Lord Latimer, where she would have lived in Snape Castle. When she did marry Henry VIII here at Hampton Court Palace, he was not well and was looking for someone to nurse him in old age, and Catherine was almost 30 years his junior. It's hard to think she married for love, but spurning King Henry VIII's advances was not something advisable. Her wisdom and tactfulness will be a great asset to her following her marriage on the 12th of July, 1543. While she never bore Henry any children, she did reconnect him with his existing children. Mary, who was only a few years younger than her, and Elizabeth had both been excluded from the royal palace, and they began to visit again. She was also influential in the passing of the Third Succession Act of 1543 that brought both daughters back in line for the succession of the throne again, showing that despite her own Protestant beliefs, she treated both daughters as equal. Mary was a staunch Catholic, and she would try to bring England back into Catholicism during her 6-year reign, while Elizabeth brought in an era of Protestant stability. Catherine was in many ways in an unenviable position, married to a power-hungry, narcissistic king who had already dispatched with several wives, yet she used her short marriage to him for the good of the nation. Endeavoring to educate her stepchildren as best she could, she brought in some of the leading Protestant scholars to aid in their learning. Mary, who was in her 20s, was set in her Catholic ways, yet Elizabeth and Edward were clearly influenced by her, which was reflected and passed down to the nation during their 6-year and 45-year reigns, respectively. Catherine in many ways reflected her mother, who was a progressive woman for her time, demonstrating how a woman could have agency in the affairs of her home and showing how one could have a participatory rather than a passive role in facing one's own destiny. And Catherine not only embodied these values, but passed them on to her stepdaughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I. After her husband died, Maud Parr started a small school in her home. It was essentially a homeschool co-op for her own children, as well as some other children, some of whom were relatives. Catherine lived at a time when the image of a scholarly woman was considered socially unacceptable and against the natural order of things that God had set up. Noble and royal women were educated, but not overly so. A woman had only 2 roles, a wife and a mother, and her education reflected that fact. Yet Catherine saw beyond these societal and cultural restrictions. Catherine was an accomplished scholar and was the first queen to have her work published, writing 3 books in total. She was always suspected by those close to the king, such as Bishop Stephen Gardiner, as being sympathetic or involved with the new reformed and outlawed faith. However, she always managed to outfox him, famously surviving a plot against her just before the king died. She was also suspected of being part of a cohort of women connected to prominent martyr Anne Askew, and during Anne's torture in the Tower of London, they tried to get her to name the Queen, yet she refused to name her. After the king died, 6 months later, she married Thomas Seymour, who some say was her first true love. But the marriage wasn't long nor particularly happy, with family feuds and controversies clouding the 18-month marriage. During her time as Lady Seymour, she mentored Lady Jane Grey, a young English noblewoman who would go on to be the Queen of England for a very brief period of time. Finally, in her 4th marriage, she bore a child, though sadly she would die on the 5th of September with complications following childbirth, most likely due to childbed fever because of a bacterial infection she got during the birthing process. Her funeral was the first Protestant funeral service to be held here in England, and she is buried here in Sudeley Castle. Catherine experienced a lot of heartache and sadness in life and found herself in a position that she might not have wanted to be in, yet she actively used her position to better the lives of others. Our lives might not turn out as we want them to, and while God has a plan A for our lives, He also has a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. May we use the times and circumstances in our lives that are not the best, and remember that our life and legacy extends beyond us to the lives of those we influence as well. Small helps us accomplish our mission. You can help us make more resources by joining our mission. You can give at lineagejourney.com.